Well, it took basically the entire NASCAR off season, but I finished another classic season. If I'm not mistaken, I uploaded the 2005 recap video, I think championship weekend, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was like Friday, which would have been the day of the truck race from Phoenix for 2023. And now here we are within a week of NASCAR starting back up, and I finally finished 2004. So it took the off season, but the next season has been completed, and I'm here to give my thoughts and review of the 2004 NASCAR Nextel Cup Series season. Now, this was a season of big change for NASCAR. Not only a new title sponsor moving from Winston to Nextel, but a new fuel supplier moving to Sunoco instead of 76 Racing Fuel. A different aero package on the race cars. For a long time, NASCAR had been, increasing the downforce, had high downforce on the cars. But starting in 2004, they had cut off about 3/4 of an inch of spoiler on the cars, so kind of knocked that down a little bit, and we saw a trend continue knocking it down even further as kind of the years went on after 2004. And also, the biggest change is the change of the point structure, where there was now a playoff type format, as they called it, the chase for the Nextel Cup, where after 26 races, the top 10 in points were set into a field where basically everyone was back on nearly level playing field for the final 10 races of the season. So, a lot to go over there. Let's get right into it, because 2005 was a video where I said I thought the Gen 4 was very overrated. I thought that the era that everyone talks about as their favorite was overrated as a whole. And I really wanted to see if 2004 would redeem or if it was going to be just like 2005. And the consensus is there is no consensus, because it was kind of a mix of what I've watched with Gen 4 so far. The season as a whole ranks at a 67.1 out of 100. Now, how do I get that ranking? Well, it's basically I just take the 36 races that I ranked from a scale of 1 to 100, and I just put in an average, and whatever the average is, that's what I give the season as a whole. So the season as a whole was a 67.1 out of 100. You may ask, how does that compare to other seasons? Well, it does definitely blow 2005 away. 2005, I had mentioned I did not like at all, and it only got 64.9 out of 100. The weird thing, though, about 2004 is that at a 67.1, that puts it just zero point 0.2 points above 2017, and it puts it actually zero point 0.4 points below 2018. Now, that seems a little bit hard to believe, because, that's 2017, 2018, 2019, 2016. That's kind of a very unpopular era of NASCAR racing. So the fact that one of the more popular eras of NASCAR racing found a way to basically be in the middle of those seasons is pretty shocking, and lower than some of those seasons, right? 2016 has 68.3, 2018 has 67.5. So what is it about 2004 that put the ranking kind of lower than what people would probably expect out of a season like this? Well, I'll get into that in a little bit, because I think there are a few factors that contribute to that. But I will say for sure, a lot better than 2005. It didn't live up to the hype of 2006. I still think that season is the best Gen 4 season as a whole that I watched. Obviously, I've not watched many, right? In terms of full Gen 4 seasons, this is only the third one I've watched, because 2007 was a split, and then you had 06, 05, and 04. So for Gen 4 standards, it's kind of, I guess, right in the middle, right? It splits 05 and it splits 06. Before I get into what made the season maybe lack a little bit, let's get into what made the season really, really good. And that's the great races that 2004 had. After, 2005 had only one race that I considered great, and it was barely on the verge of great, and it didn't have a race that I ranked over a 90. I think that's the first season where I didn't have a race in the 90s. I was really hoping that 2004 would redeem itself. And in terms of more great races, it had that, but up until late in the season, I didn't think it was going to have a race in the 90s. That is until the 2004 EA Sports 500 at Talladega happened, and I was like, okay, that's a a really, really good race. That was my favorite and best race, in my opinion, of the 2004 season. Um, it was just super fun all throughout. Something about Old Talladega is fun as well, where it's worn out and bumpy, and they can race very aggressively early on, and the pack kind of spreads out, but they can still pass each other, whatnot. And it was a race where they really raced chaotically for most of it, and handling still mattered, and they didn't really wreck all that much as well. They only had minimal accidents, and when they were, wrecking, it wasn't like they were wrecking 10, 15 cars. They were wrecking like, maybe 3, 4, 5 cars at a time. So it wasn't like we had any big wrecks as well. So it was a very fun race. I definitely recommend, if you haven't gone and watched that all the way through, that you do watch it, because it is an incredible race. I mean, we look at super speedway racing now and we go, oh, well, they got 3 wide, so it automatically makes it good. But back in these days, right, the pack would spread out a little bit more, so it wasn't like it was a gridlock, right? Right now, what they do, if they get 2 or 3 wide nowadays at a super speedway, it's a gridlock. No one can go anywhere. If you're 5th in line, you're stuck 5th in line. You're not going to be able to move unless one lane dies, and then maybe you have a shot to move. But even then, the other lane that doesn't die, that other than yours, could possibly keep you pinned where you are as well. Back then, drivers were moving through the field at will. If they wanted to go high, they would go high. Then they could maybe duck back into a hole that was there that wouldn't be there because they're gridlocked nowadays. And just to describe that, if you really want to see that at work, and what I mean by that, just watch from the final restart onwards and watch Dale Earnhardt Jr., the eventual winner. He has to pass like 10 cars to get to the win, and he only has 5 laps to do it. But he passes them at will, at points with no help. So it just shows back then, you need to have a very fast car. You need to have a guy that knew what he was doing behind the wheel of that car as well. And you could still move through the field. If you were, if we had a 5 lap to go restart nowadays at a super speedway, right, where Dale Jr. was, yes, he was lined up, 10th or 11th on the restart, but that, was a single file restart. So he had literally in front of him in a line about 10 cars. So nowadays that would be like starting back at, say, maybe 20th, where you have in your lane about 9, 10 cars in front of you. I know it's not the same because there's more cars you have to pass. Nowadays if you're lined up 20th, you have to pass 19 cars, and Dale only had to pass 10. But he had to do it while they were single file. It wasn't like they were bunched up. He was in 10th or 11th place, and it's like, okay, well, he's 6th on the inside lane, right? He was 10th in line, 10th row or 11th row, and still made the passes work, and really only took him like 2.5 laps to make it work. It is, in my opinion, probably Dale Jr. at a super speedway peak was that race right there, where he was being aggressive and did stuff like that. It's very fun to watch Dale Jr. in a DEI car at a super speedway, because he's going to be aggressive, and it's very, very fun to watch. He normally always took the runs that he had at points to a fault, but yeah, it was that's a very fun race. Definitely recommend checking that one out. It came in 6 whole points higher than the next highest, which I also thought was a really great race. And ironically, it's another Dale Jr. win, but Atlanta, the first Atlanta race, the Golden Corral 500, I have as the second best race of the season. It had really long green flag runs, not so many cautions, great tire fall off, which meant we had comers and goers throughout a run. And just like Talladega, where I said Dale had to come from behind late, he had to come from behind late in this one. He had stayed out a little bit longer than some others, right? And since others kind of short pitted, they got the tires sooner. They leapt out in front of Dale Jr., got to the lead, and Jr. had to pass like 2 or 3 cars in the final run, in the final like 20 laps to get it done. The first Atlanta race, a very fun one to watch if you like green flag racing with tire fall off and some comers and goers over long green flag runs. I really love green flag runs, especially when it's at a track like Atlanta, and that was a really good one as well. So was Martinsville, the first Martinsville race of the season. Rusty Wallace's final NASCAR Cup Series victory. And I believe that's the final race on the old Martinsville surface, because after that one, because that's the race where concrete comes up and hits Jeff Gordon. So after this race, they repaved the track, and it kind of falls off for a few years after that. But yeah, that was a fun race where once again tire fall off because it was such an old surface, and the second groove was coming in. I think that was I think in '03 they had grinded the bottom to try and make the top better, and it kind of worked. So it kind of transferred over to 2004. Had different leaders, had some good battles towards the end, and had some really kind of different drivers at the front at the end, right? Like Rusty Wallace, Bobby Labonte. So that was very fun to watch as well, that first Martinsville race. And I also want to give a shout out to the first Talladega race. Talladega had itself a great season. And the Aaron's 499 from 2004 was absolutely insane. The drivers were driving crazy all race long, and that did lead to a lot of yellows and not too many very long green flag runs, but the racing was still so good throughout. I had to give it a great race rating. So that's the four races I thought were great throughout the season. So if you ever want to watch a race from '04, I'd recommend the EA Sports 500. If you want to watch an intermediate, I'd recommend the first Atlanta race. If you want a short track, I'd recommend the first Martinsville race of that season. So there you go. That's the best stuff from 2004. Gonna start out positive, and now let's go to a little bit more of a negative, but not necessarily negative on the season, but more of a negative on just timing of everything, right? This was 2004. I have to keep reminding myself that, right? Because it's not the same. It's the same tracks as what we have now, but it's not really the same, right? What I mean by that is that back in 2004, a lot of these tracks that they were racing on were still very, very new. And when I mean very, very new, I mean they hadn't had but, 5, 7, 8 seasons on them, right? They were still very, very new. In the case of Kansas Chicagoland, this was only their fourth year of racing on them. So these tracks are pretty new. What does that mean? Well, it means that it still has new pavement on them. And when they have new pavement and stuff's getting reconfigured and stuff's getting repaved around this time, there's a lot of tracks that are going to hurt from it and have the racing quality hurt, right? Back in 2004, what tracks were still sort of new? Fontana was still pretty new. Las Vegas was still pretty new. Kansas and Chicagoland were still new. Texas was new. They had repaved Texas like 5 times up to this point. All these mile and a halves were new, and then they're repaving and reconfiguring tracks, right? Homestead got reconfigured in 2003, so it still had pretty new pavement. Martinsville got repaved in the middle of 2004. Loudon got repaved. Richmond got repaved around this time period as well. So there's a lot of tracks that they were still relatively new, and the pavement was still relatively new. What does that mean? Well, that means the groove was still narrow, and there were tracks where they still weren't running up towards the wall, right? Nowadays, we see cars running at the wall at places like Kansas. We saw at Chicagoland before the track closed down. We see it at Vegas. We see it at Homestead now. We see it, at all these intermediate tracks, they can basically run the wall, unless you're a track like Texas. Then they ruined it. And they used to run by the wall, so when the track widened out, they'd run by the wall. But back in '04, the grooves were still narrow at all these tracks, and they weren't running by the wall, right? The only track that I really thought was doing a really good job aging, right? It was only its 4th year of competition, but Kansas was pretty racy as a track for just its 4th race on the new surface. So props to Kansas, and it kind of, it continued to get better throughout the years, and then finally kind of, reached its peak and then got repaved and fell down, but then kind of came back up in the 2010s. But we're talking about the 2000s, so we'll stay on that. But I really think that hurts how some of the races in '04 ranked, right? Because you think about Chicagoland, pretty new, had a bad rating. Loudon, new surface, had a bad rating. Richmond, new surface. They repaved that one because they stopped putting that sealer down, and they felt like the sealer not putting it down messed with the track, right? So whenever they were putting it down, they kind of had to put it down so that the track wasn't undrivable. So then they had to repave it to get the sealer off the track. But the Richmonds weren't really having good races. Homestead had a very mediocre race. That's a new pavement. The second Martinsville race was pretty mediocre. That's new pavement. So there's a lot of tracks that were relatively new, and that's what leads to a little bit worse ratings. I don't think it's any coincidence that when you look at what tracks were really, really good for me in 2004 in terms of racing, right? Talladega, old surface. Atlanta, old surface. The first Martinsville, old surface. Darlington, old surface. Rockingham, old surface. Daytona, old surface. Bristol, old surface, right? So a lot of the older tracks, a lot of the tracks that were worn out, that were more unique, were, in my opinion, the better races of 2004. Now that doesn't mean some of the newer tracks didn't have good races. Both the Fontana races were inside the top 10. That track was relatively new at the time. Las Vegas, a top 12 race, relatively new. Kansas, top 15 race, relatively new. So there were some tracks that weren't necessarily that old, but still did put on some good races. And I do want to give a quick shout out to Las Vegas, right? Everyone rags on low banking Las Vegas. Now, they really had to make that change in 2007. But of what I've watched of flat Las Vegas, '04 was really good. '05 was really good. '06 wasn't amazing, but had a really good finish, right? And I just, yeah, I know people don't really like flat tracks because, for whatever reason, but Las Vegas wasn't actually that bad once the track started wearing out and kind of getting some age on it. And then as soon as it was getting really good, they repaved it and added banking. So I kind of thought that was interesting. It wasn't necessarily the track's fault. It was just NASCAR wanted so many in such a short time, and it made all intermediates look bad, like, oh, these intermediates suck. But in reality, it's just you built so many around the same time, they were all trying to wear in, and it made them all really look bad. It wasn't necessarily an intermediate problem. It was just, hey, we made too many of them in, too short of a time period. They really need to be more spaced out or more unique. If they were a little bit more unique, then it wouldn't just be an intermediate problem. You could point to, hey, these things have newer track surfaces, and that's an issue with them. And I had mentioned about all the new stuff for '04. One of those changes was lowering the downforce. They took some spoiler height off of the rear spoiler, trying to reduce the downforce. And back then, it was the goal of making it so that tires mattered more and Goodyear could bring a more aggressive tire to the racetrack. That was a big storyline from '03. I'd kind of looked up some articles about it to just I wanted to see if there was a specified reason why NASCAR decided to take the spoiler height down a little bit. And what I mostly found was that fans were getting a little bit tired of how much track position meant, right? In terms of, stuff was coming down to fuel mileage because drivers were pitting, and then not, if they could be near a window, they wouldn't pit again. They wouldn't need to take tires. At points, it was mostly just fuel only on pit road and all this stuff in '03 and '02 and stuff like that. And races were coming down to fuel mileage a bunch, and it was all about track position and Tires were lasting like 70 to 80 to 90 laps at a time, even at intermediates. So NASCAR reduced the downforce, and drivers and NASCAR executives alike said that this should help Goodyear bring a softer, more aggressive, more worn-out tire to the racetrack because they were going to have lower corner speeds. Where have we heard something like that where it's been argued they need to reduce the downforce of the cars to have lower corner speeds so that Goodyear could bring a tire that can withstand the load? It's the current time, by the way. It's the next-gen car. Learned from the past. Maybe they will. Maybe they'll lower the downforce on the next-gen car so Goodyear can bring a more aggressive tire to the track that they won't fear will explode because it's going to be under severe load when they're running like 170 miles an hour in the center of the corner. Moving on. Back to the low downforce for '04. Something that was actually interesting early on in the season, I think it was Darlington, right? They had run like 10, 15 laps, and then the whole field came down pit road. They all took 4 tires. And DW was like, now this is one of the things I hate about the softer tires. We're not seeing any pit strategy today. They're all taking 4 tires every caution flag. And I'm like, that's interesting that they wanted tires that didn't really matter. They wanted it to be like, oh, you could stay out on 10, 15 lap tires at Darlington and still hold the lead. I don't really agree with that. I don't think that's fun to watch, but whatever they want, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, that was a little weird, right? Was that DW was kind of like, I don't know if I agree with these softer tires and the lower downforce. It seems to be taking the strategy aspect away, but everyone's complaining about the strategy aspect. Like, I don't know. It was very, very weird. And moving on to another topic of conversation is 2004 was the final year before NASCAR made changes to kind of what RPMs and what gear ratios teams could run. 2005, they kind of set, they gave teams options on gear ratios, and they said you could pick one or the other, basically trying to limit the amount of RPMs that teams were running at racetracks. Why does that matter? Well, the higher RPMs, the more sustained RPMs you have, the more likely you're going to have an engine go boom. And NASCAR really did not like that, and they said, hey, we want to reduce the RPMs you guys are running, because at points, at tracks like Michigan, and even at Homestead, any intermediate track, any bigger track, they were running nearly 10,000 RPMs at the end of the straightaway. I mean, there's moments from Michigan where they're hitting like almost 9,700 RPM, and I'm like, that engine had to be screaming by the time it got into turn one. I mean, it's crazy to see the amount of RPMs that they were turning. NASCAR didn't like it, because not only were teams trying to build an engine with the most power, now they're trying to build an engine that's going to last all 400, 500 miles with RPMs that high. And durability was coming to play, and a lot of teams were blowing engines, and engine failures were happening left and right. So NASCAR in 05 decided, hey, we're going to, limit the gear ratios you guys could run at each racetrack. They said it was in the name of cost savings. And I believe it was actually that Michigan race I referenced where the NBC crew, or I guess it was the TNT crew, made that a discussion, right? They had talked about how NASCAR is going to do that for 05 for cost-saving measures, and then Alan Bestwick shifted to Benny Parsons and Wally Dallenbach and asked them, how do you feel about the changes? BP said, I like it. They have to save the teams from themselves, and this should help save money. It should also help some of the smaller teams, right? Catch up to maybe some of the bigger teams like Hendrick and Roush that had really good engine programs, and those smaller teams maybe didn't have that. On the other hand, Wally disagreed. He said, yes, it's going to save the teams money on engines. However, the teams aren't going to save any money at all because the money they save on that, they're going to put towards something else that they can improve on their team. Maybe faster pit stops, maybe better, parts on other areas of the race car, more aerodynamic wind tunnel testing, more practice testing, more test session testing. So Wally didn't believe that it was going to save the team's money. He just said, listen, they're going to be spending the same amount of money. They're just going to shift the money they save on the engines to something else. It's not going to save money at all. And what's really funny is that what Wally said back then not only was true then, but 20 years later is still true now. Right? NASCAR says, oh, we're running lower horsepower in these cars, for a new manufacturer. And then it kind of got shifted to, oh, we're running lower horsepower in these cars to save the teams money on their engines. And then team owners and whoever have come out and said, yeah, we're not really saving money. It's still costing the same amount to run a 670 horsepower engine. It's costing the same to run a 900 horsepower engine because we're still trying to push every single ounce of horsepower out of this engine. And if anything, limiting it, right? Trying to find 1 horsepower in the engine. It is just as important as trying to find maybe 5, 10 horsepower on an unrestricted engine and might cost as much, even more. So once again, NASCAR says we're trying to save the team's money. They're not saving the team's money. NASCAR says we're trying to save the team's money by practicing less. Guess what? They're not saving money at all because all that money they save, where's it going? Probably into simulator work. Probably into stuff like that, right? No matter what you do to try and save the team's money, they're going to take the money they save and force it somewhere else because after all, it's a sport, it's a competition sport. You're trying to be the best you can be, so trying to save the team's money in any area is not going to work. It was true when Wally said it in 2004, and 20 years later, Wally's statements still ring true in that you can save the team's money all you want, but they are going to use that money they save on something else. They're not going to actually save it at the end of the season. So with that out of the way, Now let's get to the first year of the chase for the NASCAR Nextel Cup and how chaotic it was and how interesting it was seeing the commentators have to find out how is this going to work out now, right? Because they didn't know the strategies. They didn't know what the regular season was going to be like. They didn't know what the chase was going to be like. And one of the funniest things was at the beginning of the season where a driver or two, right, that had been running well, maybe had a bad race. I'll give an example. Dale Earnhardt Jr. had a very, 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 very bad Las Vegas race where the car was handling so bad he went to the garage multiple times and finished laps down. And not just a few laps down, I mean laps down, like dozens of laps down. And, he finishes really poorly. And I think it was Larry brought up a point like, oh, he's used up one of his bad races. If he has like one or two more of those, he's not going to make the chase. And I found that hysterical. Right? Was that Larry Mack saying 2 or 3 bad races could knock one of the top drivers out of the chase. And I was like, that's not right, right? 26 races, you can have like 5 or 6 bad races and still be inside the top 10 in points. Now, what Larry was saying would maybe apply to someone who was back in like 15th in points, someone like, Jimmy McMurray who just missed out, Rusty Wallace, Bobby Labonte, Kevin Harvick that were just on the outside looking in, right? That applies to them if you have too many bad races, but if you're a top team driver, right? Like Matt Kenseth having 2 bad races at the beginning of 2004 wouldn't have been a detriment to him, right? He was still very, very good and very consistent. It wasn't like, oh, all these drivers have to be perfect. Basically, what Fox was trying to broadcast it as is the pressure is on for all 26 of these races. You have to be perfect in them, and then when you get to the final 10, you have to be even more perfect, and that's the complete opposite, right? We saw the chase actually get broken later in later years where a team like Jimmy Johnson's, the 48 team, completely gave up in the middle of the regular season because they were like, all right, we're far enough ahead of the cutoff. We don't have to worry about, falling outside of the top 10 in points. We can just cruise our way into the chase, not really have to focus on these summer tracks. We'll put all our focus in those final 10, and we'll make a run for the championship. And what happened? They won the championship 5 straight seasons by basically giving up the second half of the regular season to focus on those final 10 races and bringing their best stuff for the final 10. It's really funny how that worked out, how it's kind of the complete opposite of what Fox thought it was, where they're like, you have to be really, really, really good for these 26 races, all of them. You can have very few mistakes. Whereas, it turned into, hey, teams are like kind of giving up in the middle of the season because, they're so far ahead of 10th place, they don't really have to try anymore. So that was one of the downsides of the chase was, teams locking up or not necessarily locking up, but getting far enough ahead to where they're like, all right, yeah, we're good. Now here's something that maybe some people watching don't even know about. The original chase used from 2004 to 2006 was just 10 drivers, right? Not necessarily the case. There is a not necessarily well known, and if it is known, never talked about because it never comes into play. There was a 400 point mark. What that meant was after 26 races, the drivers that made the chase were either the top 10 in points or drivers within 400 points of the points leader, whatever was more. So basically, you didn't have to be within 400 points if you were inside the top 10. But if you were, say, 13th in points and you left Richmond 398 points behind the points leader, you were in the chase. So there was a chance from 04 to 06 to have a very weird, 11-man chase, 13-man chase, 14-man chase, right? It could have been a very, very interesting scenario where you had an odd number or some weird, not really talked about number make the chase. Unfortunately, it never came into play. In fact, the only season it really had a chance to come into play was 2004. At one point in the middle of the race, Jimmy Johnson was crashed out. Dale Jr. was at the back because he was involved in that crash and had damage. Jeff Gordon had been caught on a strategy play and he was at the back of the field. They were the top 3 in points entering into the race. They showed the points, and the 400-point mark was going to come into play. They were going to have like 12 or 13 drivers in the chase. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. Junior and Gordon moved their way through the field to get top 10 finishes, and they kept drivers outside the top 10 in points from being within 400 points at the end of the regular season. But that's just very interesting to me to that back in '04, that was a very, very big topic. Was would the 400-point mark come into play? And kind of towards the middle of the summer, it was looking very grim, and NBC and TNT were kind of giving up on it. They were like, the 400-point mark is really out of range now. These drivers are like 150, 200 points behind. But then Jimmy and Gordon and all them up in points were starting to have bad races, and that 400-point mark started to come slowly back into play, and it nearly did come into play after Richmond. Unfortunately, it didn't, because I think that would have been very cool to see, like 11-man chase or something, right? Would have been the original 2013 with having an odd number of drivers in the chase for the Nextel Cup. That's a very fun fact that not many people talk about because it never came into play, and NASCAR abolished it after '06 because then they just added 2 more drivers into the chase. And speaking of the 400-point mark in Richmond's chaos set the stage perfectly for how this system could really, really work out if the points are really close at the end of the regular season. It it was super chaotic, right? It was so close entering into Richmond with how close the points were for 10th. It was like from 7th or so back to like 14th or 15th, still had a shot to make it into the chase, and I'm like, oh my god, there's like 8-9 drivers going for like 3 spots, and it's absolutely insane how close it was there, and how close McMurray was, and how Casey Kane had a shot, but he really fumbled the bag at Richmond. His car wasn't good. He got spun by Dale Jr. He fell out. Ryan Newman was on the bubble at points. It was just close, right? And then out of nowhere, Jeremy Mayfield comes through and gets the win. And then, Jeremy Mayfield bumps his way up in with that win and knocks his teammate out. And, guys are missing it by just a few points. And, it's an absolutely insane Richmond race. And on top of that, Jimmy Johnson involved in a crash trying to, be the points leader to be the top seed entering into the chase. But then, he falls to second in points. Jeff Gordon is now the points leader entering into the chase. And he's the top seed. And Dale Jr. almost gets his second because of Jimmy's misfortunes. So, there was a lot that Richmond did really well, and it was very fun to see. But now, that's the run-up to the chase and some of the talk of the chase. Now let's get to possibly the craziest chase ever, maybe one of the craziest Final 10 races NASCAR has ever had, and it just so happened to be the first season of the chase for the Nextel Cup. Let's start off with the fact that broadcasters didn't know what the right strategy was going to be for the chase, right? Was it going to be consistency rules? Were you going to want to have a lot of wins? What was it going to be like, right? Was it going to be a bunch of drivers, these 10 drivers going for the win every week? Was it going to be these 10 drivers just settling for a good point stay inside the top 10, top 5? That's an interesting side effect of the chase that comes into play in later seasons, right? Where I think by, 07, 08, it turned from, going for wins to just wanting to finish 8th, right? 7th or 8th, just get a good point stay. It turned into a system of wanting good point stays and not necessarily wanting race victories. And we also had the argument of a mulligan, right? The one mulligan rule, as it's called. New Hampshire happened, right? Robbie Gordon and Greg Biffle got into each other early on, and then Robbie Gordon decided to retaliate against Greg Biffle, and unfortunately, he caught chasers up in the mess, right? Tony Stewart was involved, Jeremy Mayfield was involved in the crash, and Benny Parsons was of the belief that you would have one mulligan in the chase because everyone at one point in the final 10 races was going to have a bad race. Wally completely disagreed with this, and he said, that's not necessarily true, because what if someone doesn't have a bad race? Then you're behind by a bad race. And both sides have good arguments, because in '04, everyone did take a mulligan in the chase. But there are some seasons. Tony Stewart didn't really take a mulligan in '05. He kind of did with Dover, but it wasn't really that big of a mulligan, right? There were some seasons where drivers had really, 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 really good chases, and you couldn't catch them because they didn't take a mulligan. So there were some seasons where you had to be perfect and be on at all times. And then there were seasons like '04 where everyone had a down race, or '06 where everyone was trying to give the championship away. So it's interesting to see that talked about because, once again, first season of the chase, no one knew how it was going to play out. And now let's talk about some of the drivers and some of the big names that were involved in it. Kurt Busch had to overcome so much in this chase. I feel like it was nearly every chase race he had to work his way from the back. And he found himself in issues so much, right? I think about Kansas, where he's spun, right? He's in a spin, but comes back to finish well. I think back to Charlotte, involved in a crash, finishes well. Lap 1, by the way, finishes well. So many races where he had to come from behind, Darlington and even Phoenix. He's having to come from the back and move his way through the field. And then obviously the one that everyone knows, Homestead, where he loses a wheel right at pit entry, and the wheel just so happens to go onto the racetrack, and Kurt can barely miss the pit barrels, get on the pit road, the caution comes out, he never loses a lap, and he fights back to finish inside the top 10, win the championship by just a measly 8 points. That's something else to talk about, is that the championship came down to just 8 points, and the top 3 were within 16 points at the end of the season. So Kurt Busch, his chase, he had to overcome so much, but the frustrating part was he was so consistent, right? He only ever had really one down race, and that was when he blew an engine at Atlanta. Other than that, every other race, he was a contender at the front, and he got lucky breaks to get himself up and back towards the front, even if he had issues, right? There were, cautions that came at the right time. If he spun, he didn't get hit. If he got damaged, it was very minimal and was able to be repaired. If it was, the Homestead tire deal, he didn't nail the pit road wall. The tire went out to the racetrack to cause the caution. I mean, there was a lot that went his way, even after stuff wasn't going his way. Kurt got very lucky in '04 and got to the championship. I'd say he kind of lucked into it, even though he ran probably the best of the 10 drivers in those final 10 races. He had to have a lot of luck to do it as well. And another driver who ran really well, but really only for those final 5 or so races, was Jimmie Johnson. Jimmie, at one point, was over 200 points down with 6 races to go. That's like nearly impossible to make up. But he got 3 straight wins, and then got 4 or 5. And then the ones he didn't win, he ended up with like top 5s and top 10s. And Jimmie went from like 230 some points back with 6 races to go to finish 8 points back at Homestead. Jimmie Johnson, I mean, it was amazing, right? At Kansas, he spun and then he wrecked, and I'm just like, man, if he didn't wreck his car at Kansas, he wins the championship, right? That was the race, because he had already had bad races at that point. That was the race that really took him out of it, and it's just crazy how that happened, right? How Jimmie had so many issues, yet still nearly came back and won, because he then, in the final half of the chase, was on a full win tear. So kind of once again, consistency or wins. Well, Jimmie almost took the winning route, even without consistency, to get to the championship. And then the other big player in this was Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was one of the favorites for the title. But the issue with the 8 car was that when they had a good car, they were really, really good. But when they were off a little bit, they weren't off a little bit, they were off a lot of it. And that was just the unfortunate issues for that 8 team in the chase. And they kind of shot themselves in the foot a few races as well. You think about, they had a good start to the chase, top 10s at Loudon and at Dover, and top 10 at Kansas. That was a race he was really concerned about. Went to Talladega and won the race and was going to leave as the points leader. But then Dale Jr. said the word in victory lane that you shouldn't be saying, apparently, and got docked 25 points. Now, that was a whole deal, a whole thing about it. Dale Jr., when being asked about it the next week, said, listen, I do think what I did was wrong and that I deserve some sort of penalty. But he says the points are on the board. They shouldn't be taken off the board, right, for something that happened after the race in victory lane, not out on the racetrack. NASCAR obviously didn't agree with that and kept the penalty, upheld the penalty to Dale Jr. That was a major talking point. They asked, once again, NBC, Alan Bestwick asked Wally and Benny their thoughts on the penalty. Should he have been docked points? Should it have just been money? Should it have been something? Benny said they had to get the driver's attention. They had to make them listen, so they had to dock points. Wally said, yeah, he deserved something. Probably didn't deserve the points. He said they should have docked them $250,000. That would really get a driver's attention. But yeah, it definitely set a different tone for the 8 team in the final races of that chase, because they went from on top after Talladega to then still chasing Kurt Busch, and then going into the next race they were still chasing Kurt Busch after that one, still chasing Kurt Busch, and Martinsville then happened. They had their issues. They dropped in points. And then Atlanta happened. Kurt Busch blew the engine early. Dale Jr. has a top 5, top 10 car. And late in the race is going. He sees Mark Martin slipping in front. The race leader's not too far in front. And trying to get up in front of Edwards, he spins himself off the nose. And, while it didn't at that time kill his championship chances, it pretty much did knock him out of the championship fight. And while he recovered the next week to win Phoenix and get himself back into it, he was so far back he didn't have a shot. So the 8 team was another team that got in their own way basically at points, and then a terrible run at Homestead didn't help them any at all. I don't think he ever saw the top 5 during that race. And I had mentioned already how close it was at Homestead in terms of the end of the race, but at one point in the middle of the race, the top 4 in points were within 9 points of each other. It was like Jimmy leading by a point over Kurt. Jeff Gordon was like 2 points behind or something. I mean, it was absolutely insane. Here's the picture. Kurt Busch. So Jimmy's leading. Kurt Busch 1 point behind. Jeff Gordon 6 behind. Mark Martin 9 behind. So the top 4 in points within 9 points of each other, and that was with like 65 laps to go. Something like that. 65, 70 laps to go. So it was pretty late in the race. So I mean, NASCAR got themselves a really good first season for the chase. Unfortunately, not every season lived up to that. The only one I can really think about that was kind of close to this was 06 and to an extent 010, 2010. And then up until 2011 had it. 2012 has had a pretty good one as well. But in terms of the chaos and the unpredictability, I'd say really 04, the only one that matches it is 06. It was. Kurt Busch really tried that team tried to give the championship away a lot, but it didn't happen. So, yeah, that's my 2004 review. I don't know what I'm going to do for the next season. I don't know if I'm going to go back to 03, if I'm going to go to 2020 to, for some reason, relive a 550 type season. We'll just have to see what I do there. But that's it for 04. I talked a lot, rambled a lot, but I mean, there was a lot to go over for 2004. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next one.